Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson, for speaking to Press Trust of India on the occasion of World Environment Day. It's a great pleasure to have you again on our platform once
Oh,
again.
it's my pleasure.
This year's World Environment Day focus is climate action. And I just want to start with this topic that what makes this theme so critical at this point of time, and why is immediate action more important now than ever before?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you to Press Trust of India for looking at this issue because climate action, yes, is the theme of this year's World Environment Day. And why? Because the science is very clear, right? The window is closing, we're inching towards and will bypass 1.5, and the impacts are intensifying. And we're now 10 years after the Paris Agreement, and a lot of good progress has been made. Let's be very clear about that, including in beautiful India. But climate action now has never been more critical. And yeah, the reality is that the multilateral system is under stress, but you can't negotiate with physics, right? Regardless of geopolitics, action has to be taken to protect people. And here's the thing. Climate action will deliver jobs, will deliver cheaper electricity, will deliver cleaner air, will deliver food security. And we know already that wind power and solar power is less than half of what hydrocarbon fossil fuel prices are per kilowatt hour. And so, but the reality is that we're still hooked on oil, right? We see that from the Middle East conflict. Uh, but but the jobs lie in leaning into the cleaner and greener, and that's the opportunity. So we have, and of course, also we need to deal with adaptation, and this is where protecting forest and safeguarding our water can be instrumental in preventing floods and droughts and fires. And that's, of course, very, very critical. So that's the focus of this year's World Environment Day.
Right. Um, I want to also focus on the current situation in India, that is the severe life-threatening heat waves that we are seeing. There was also a recent study that found out that India's heat waves, which pushed temperatures past 45 degrees Celsius and exposed 44 million people to dangerous conditions, was intensified by up to 2 degrees Celsius because of human-driven climate change. My question in this context is that what, in your view, are the most critical and immediate strategies for India to mitigate this crisis?
Well, I mean, first of all, you're right, right? With these extreme heat temperatures, which, by the way, we're seeing across the world, it threatens lives, especially those, the elderly, pregnant, or young children, or those who have immune system suppression. It threatens livelihoods for those of us who have to work outside. And right now, heat stress kills more people each year than floods and storms and wildfires combined. So this is a stress. And of course, India is living with that right now. Here, I mean, we have seen that New Delhi is one of the hottest major cities on the planet. And we've seen with humidity temperatures reaching towards the 50-degree, which is, of course, impossible. What is good is that we are also seeing some beginning investments into this space. We are proud from UNEP side to lead something we call the Cool Coalition. And here we're seeing India, for example, putting $1.5 billion national disaster mitigation funds to redesign and reallocate for passive cooling. And here's the thing, right? If you go into the countryside and walk through a field, you will know that it is likely cooler than if you walk in an urban concrete setting. And so the more we think about our cities to cool down our cities, for example, the Kashmir Gate Interstate Bus Terminal, they're now installing this cool roof that will cover nearly 150,000 square feet, I think, and it will bring down the temperature for about 100,000 commuters daily. And these kind of investments are critical, and that's where the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban, the flagship of India, that is now also investing in passive cooling for about 10 million homes by 2029. not only will passive cooling, this means green roofs, reflective roofs, maybe they're white, more trees if possible, that can bring down the temperature, smart buildings, smart glazing, things like that. We can bring down the temperature. And when we bring down the temperature, we also bring down the cost of cooling. And that can therefore lower the bill, the electricity bill, as bringing down the temperature. These are the kind of things that we need to do. Passive cooling with wall and roof design, with glazing, shading, ventilation, and green and blue spaces. This is really how we can more cheaply bring down the cost than very expensive and polluting air conditioners. This is a kind of solutions that we are supporting, and we are happy to see that India is also pursuing that.
Right. The Cool Coalition's Beat the Heat initiative has been enrolled in around 44 cities in India so far, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Delhi, as you mentioned, Kashmiri Gate project. But do you think, does the current pace of heat adaptation here truly match the speed at which heat risk is growing in our country?
Look, I mean, it's a catch-up process, right? And it doesn't happen from one day to the next. But we are very happy to see 44 cities enroll. We're happy to see the government step into this space to lead. But the reality remains that, across the world, more than 1 billion people lack adequate cooling, including in India. And if we do not take action, that number, the 1 billion, will become 3 billion by 2050 because of the rising temperatures. And the urban heat that I spoke to, that's very, very intense. I mean, local temperatures, we can see that they rise more than 10 degrees than in a rural zone with a wind that could be bring a bit of a breeze, and the surrounding natural habitat that brings down the temperatures. So the urban poor is really where the heaviest exposure is, and that's really where the emphasis has to be, which is why this passive cooling story that I just spoke about is so important. Now, has India caught up? No one has caught up. Everybody is trying to play catch up with this. But what we just need to see is a consistent and steady investment in the cooling story, especially in the urban setting, and a very, very proactive addressing of the climate CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases, because at the end of the day, that is how we will keep the temperature to a livable level in terms of how it is increasing. Right now, 74 countries have pledged to reduce global cooling related emissions by 2050. They have pledged to do so by 68%. And so that's really good. And we have 134 countries out of the 193 that have integrated cooling itself into their national climate plan, the NDC, and that's the national determined contribution, and that's really very meaningful. At the COP in Brazil, Brazil mobilized what the Beat the Heat Mutirão contra calor extremo, they called it, and this was a big drive. And so we now have all of these cities from Rio de Janeiro to Chennai, New Delhi, to Nairobi, where I speak to you from, that have signed up for this work.
Ms. Anderson, I also want to ask about this report that has come from the WMO, which says that many global heat records are set to be broken in next 5 years. How concerning is that?
It's very concerning. It's very concerning. And it is especially concerning for those who work outdoors and doing physical work, but also for those that are vulnerable, the elderly, the pregnant women, or children, infants, as well as those who have other diseases. But when we speak, just focusing for a moment on workers, we're talking about 2.5 billion, 2.4 billion or so, which is about 70% of the global workforce, who are likely exposed to dangerous heat, including about 82% of India's informal workforce. And those obviously most exposed are construction, people in construction, in labor that is outside, physical, street vendors, an informal sector, agricultural, in an urban agricultural setting can also at times have some degree of exposure, but it is really the inner in the city space that we are most exposed. And And this is where we have to talk globally about how do we protect these critical things, construction, street vendors, informal sector laborers. And so we have to think about heat action plans. We have to think about cooling off centers, adequate water. We have to think about early warning, shaded rest, of course, cool roofs in informal settlements, adjusted work hours during peak if peak heat. These are the kind of dimensions that we have to be very mindful of. And I think as and we're seeing that in India too, more and more leaning into green jobs, there are some opportunities here. And we can see that India, with its massive push forward on renewable, there's this potential for 3 to 4 million jobs in the green sector in short and long term. So maybe some shifts can also happen from some of the more exposed sectors. But it is a global to-do item, I would say, and India certainly has it also on its to-do list.
Ms. Anderson, you mentioned about the informal workers, which is also one of the most vulnerable populations when it comes to heat stress. Do you think that when we talk about the shaded areas and separating their work hours during the extreme peak heat time, these workers also suffer from income losses? And when we talk about this particular issue, one aspect that comes up is the parametric insurance, social security. How do you think that measures like parametric insurance can act as safety net for these vulnerable population?
Well, obviously, the fact that countries are beginning to roll out these kind of systems and safety nets in a way under workers is critical. It has a burden on the public purse. That's the reality, but it has a gain on well-being and hopefully on reducing. Yes, let's talk about fatalities due to heat. So, to the extent that countries are able to roll out such schemes that can put a degree of protection under those workers who are the most vulnerable, so that yes, they can be protected. In the long run, you are protecting, therefore, those people's long-term productivity, because God forbid they were to die and due to heat stress, there would be families left behind, uncared for children left behind, and a productive, it sounds very unemotional to speak about this, but workforce is the strength of any economy, and therefore protecting that asset, the human skills asset and the human capital is very important. But the reality is that not all countries can afford to do that. But where countries are rolling out such schemes, it's certainly worthwhile to have a national conversation about the protection and the extent to which one can pull a net under those who are the most exposed to high heat.
Right. Thank you for those insights. I want to discuss about the India's climate targets for this year. India has updated its NDC commitments for 2035, which is a target of 47% emissions intensity cut and 60% non-fossil power capacity. From a global perspective, Ms. Anderson, how do you view India's current climate targets?
Look, I mean, India is really doubling down on its climate commitments, and we celebrate that. In the NDC that was issued just a couple of months back in March, there was a clear signal that India intends to stay on track for the 2070 net zero target, and this is good. As you rightly mentioned, this NDC 3.0 that goes from 31 to 35 includes that 47% reduction of emissions and 60% non-fossil fuel energy installed by 35. So this is good. This whole looking at how India is leaning into renewable energy, that sits very much at the center of India's Viksit Bharat 2047 strategic pathway and the self-reliance ambitions. And so it's very important. And of course, we can see now with the pressure from the Strait of Hormuz, how that self-reliance can play up to sustain India's growth development and that reliance. So we're very pleased to see this. We're also pleased to see India on the adaptation side, as well as a degree of sequestration. The India's commitment to expand forest and tree cover. It will be good for India. It will be good for local and climate. It will be good for resilience, and it will be good for adaptation. It will be good for cooling. So, I mean, that is also good. And of course, from a CO2 absorption perspective. So all in all, I would say we are asking all of the big emitters, and India does fall together with the G20 and frankly G35 if we look at it in a high emitting category. So we're looking at all of the high emitters to lean in, and the truth is also this is where jobs, opportunity, growth, and investments and better health for the people will lie. So it's a very smart move that India is making.
Right. As we're also talking about renewables here, as we speak about NDC, we know that we understand that India is rapidly scaling up the renewable sector, but while still managing their coal dependence. In your view, what does a just transition at this stage looks like? And most importantly, what role do you see the international community playing in supporting developing nations like India through this transition, especially if we talk about technology transfer?
I mean, technology transfer is part and parcel of the Paris Agreement and therefore a critical dimension. But let's look at that technology, the renewable energy, and it is booming. It is booming. And frankly, India is a big producer itself of renewable energy infrastructure. And so, I mean, that means that actually it's market worthy thanks to the ingenuity and investment and real sheer force of India's economy. And we are seeing now, of course, renewables has surpassed the world in terms of being the largest electricity source in 2025. I speak to you from Africa just for a moment here, and from Kenya, where 92% of electricity comes from renewables. And this is an importing country, oil importing, but 92%. They're still working on the getting full access, 100% access, but it's important, right? And when we look at India's electricity plans, the goal that it sets to have, I think it's well over 500 gigawatts of renewable that by 2030, which is like a tripling. So that is true. Now, long-term policy, which India has now set, sort of since the first NDC, a direction has been set that this is the journey of travel, and that has meant that the investments they can see that there's predictability. Now, there we agreed back in Paris that climate finance, especially access on technology, but also finance itself, would be an important element. But we arrived at this point, and that remains so. That is a non-negotiable. But we have arrived at this point where electricity generated from renewable is cheaper than electricity generated from fossil fuels, and therefore it can also self-sustain itself through just regular, good old-fashioned investments. But as we invent new things, especially night storage, if we're relying on solar, or other dimensions, then it becomes at night storage as for high demand infrastructure, then it becomes very important that we talk about technology transfer and access to financing for these kind of interventions. So it remains a critical dimension, climate justice, to have access to finance. And it has been one of the big issues, as you well know, in the climate talks. The initial goal of the 100 billion by 2020 was only met in 2022 or 3, and the new goal is one that we are still striving for. And so we will continue to keep our eyes on this goal, on financing, but also, of course, on the investments that will be derived from the private sector.
Right. Thank you for those details, Ms. Anderson. I want to move on to another important, crucial topic that remains in India throughout the year, which is clean air. We also discussed this last year, I remember, during World Environment Day, where you mentioned that it is us who created this problem and therefore it's us who have to solve it. Still remember it. And but we also understand that the government has been taking action measures to
Yeah.
tackle this crisis. Recently, India also chaired a high-level meeting on 26th of May on air pollution in Delhi, focusing on early action before winter through stricter enforcement and time-bound implementation of measures. Ms. Anderson, what, in your view, is a successful strategy to ensure that such time-bound targets are actually met on time?
Well, obviously, I mean, so as we said last year, where does all this pollution come from? It comes from our human activity. I don't want to blame us, but this is a system that we've created, right? So dirty coal, agricultural burning, dirty emissions from vehicles, that's the primary source of this. So to deal with cleaner air, then we have to have some short-term emergency measures that we can deal with. And different countries have experimented with different things, limiting the amount of traffic, limiting some factories in terms, and of course, agricultural burning. But the real long-term solution, of course, lies in shifting to electric mobility, cleaning up the existing vehicle fleet, by, having it to go to get tested for emissions, and get a little decal that you put in front of your window saying that my vehicle, even if it's from some years back, has emission standards that is allowable, and enforcement by police to ensure that if my decal is not there, then I will get fined and taken off the road. I mean, it's very basic, but it is these kind of things that need to happen. And of course, as I said, dealing with some of the heavier footprint traffic, buses, trucks, lorries, that often run on diesel and has blue fumes coming out of their exhaust. Those kind of vehicles we do see on many roads across the world. And then scaling up electric vehicles, as I mentioned. The two-wheelers and the three-wheelers, they're particularly high polluting, the two-strokes. And so that's the dimension. And of course, investing in public transport that is clean and green. Having good access to cleaner cooking solutions for those that are still cooking over charcoal. And being very mindful also about indoor air pollution, which often affects women and girls more. And so these are the kind of dimensions. And then we have the more localized pollution, like demolition pollution from concrete if you are building and constructing, or those kind of areas, or sand and dust storms that can come and sweep over a city. Those dimensions are also important. But it takes all of the above. And then, of course, open waste burning. This is a noxious situation because it's a toxic cocktail that we burn when we burn plastic and other things. And so it's not only CO2, it's all kinds of chemicals, tens of thousands of chemicals that we are then breathing in. And obviously, we know very well that that kind of air, that's where we see incidences of cancer go up and so on and so forth. So it becomes very important that we deal with solid waste management in an appropriate way. We reduce our plastic footprint so that we do not have all this plastic lying about that then people burn, and that we think about alternatives. So that's kind of what needs to happen. It will demand a strong campaign and action from the government side in any country, including India. But the government has had some very successful campaigns in the past. So I don't see why this is not, and people really want solutions. So I don't see why this could not work under these very ambitious targets that the government has now set. And I think the meeting that took place just a couple of days ago was really helpful because it shone a light on, okay, so the winter is coming. How can we do it? What are the actions? And I think this is precisely the way that we can do. And let's remember, of course, back to the productivity. If I don't have asthma, if my child is not sick, I will not put a burden on the health system. I will actually go to work and do something productive that will help the economy. If my child is sick, and maybe getting childhood asthma that will last for 70 years, that will be a burden on the economy. So the more that we invest in this, the less burden on the health system and the more productive citizens we have, and therefore a more vibrant economic growth and development opportunities. So there's more to be done in this chapter, but it is important that the government is leaning in on it.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson. Before we close off this interview, what message would you like to share for India for this World Environment Day?
You know, this magic little blue planet that we have, and we just had, everybody is going to space and looking back over their shoulder and seeing it. It's floating out there in a sea of darkness. It is very precious. It belongs to everyone, and it gives us everything that we know. And so on this World Environment Day and on every day, we need to understand that it's our duty collectively to lean in and protect this space we call home. And climate change, which is the focus of this year's World Environment Day, is an important area where we want to push. But the solutions are right there, and they are happening fast. And so this is not a hopeless story. This is a story of optimism, of jobs, of growth, of green economy, of cleaner and greener, of better health, and more supplies of food. So let's look at it this way and lean in and celebrate World Environment Day and take the climate action that we need to take.
Right. Thank you so much, Ms. Anderson, for your time. Those were some really good insights that we had.